of the subtle but noticeable transitions I've observed in the past decade has been a transition from a kind of subtle poking at men in general, the notion that there's a problem with the way men are raised or how they behave at school, and that some measures could be taken to address this, to a general trend of what I would call essentializing men and male behavior. And the internet is chock full of titles and newspaper articles where you have these types of things. By that I mean the trend of strange titles such as masculinity is just a daft stereotype, it doesn't mean anything to be a man, Stephen Paddock killing people in Las Vegas had nothing to do with toxic masculinity. And then if you go down later in the article, the person talks about, you strip away the toxic aspect and all you get is the following. But strip away the so-called toxic aspects of masculinity, the aggression, the violence, the hate, the guns, and what are you left with? Strength, endurance, a woody scented perfume, a liking for the color blue. Certainly nothing that need be associated with manhood or maleness. And some of these publications are quote-unquote notable publications, like The Independent or The Guardian or what have you. But there is that subtle difference between things said approximately 10 years ago, where it was viewed that there was a problem that needed to be addressed, to essentially the existence of men itself being a problem. And this actually is nothing new in the history books. When you have any population or group of people that tends to generate observable trends, no matter how faint those trends are, if there are vested interests that are opposed to that group, or there is group competition, then there is a tendency to essentialize that group. What do I mean by essentialize? Well, essentialization, in this sense, is claiming that certain types of behavior, certain attributes, certain things that are done, deeds, are an essential part of the nature of the group in question. More typically, this is done of ethnic or religious groups, because it's easier to target them than, well, half of humanity. And I'll get into the reasons why that's the case. You take certain tendencies or certain manifestations and you essentialize them and say it's an inherent part of group X. And throughout history, this has been used very craftily in political propaganda and in, well, frankly speaking, getting rid of, eliminating certain groups that were seen as disfavorable or in competition with the group projecting the essentialist claims. Now, there are subtle differences between essentializing ethnic or religious groups versus essentializing men. For one thing, although you can deny resources to both religious and or ethnic groups, and to men, as you see quite readily in, say, the breakdown between spending on things like prostate cancer versus breast cancer, you can't really round men up, per se, and dump them into a pogrom or ship them off or whatever. Historically, that's never been done. It's always been men of a certain group. Again, it's much easier to do this with a distinct ethnic group than it is to do with men in general. Nonetheless, the trend that is now very observable is that there are tendencies that are on display in the male populace that have been essentialized and they're part of just male nature. Every time somebody has an agenda, usually a political agenda, they will take a group that might have certain exponents of, take your pick, behavior A, B, and C, and claim that not only does that group, on average, have a tendency to display behavior A, B, and C, it is in the nature of the group in question to exhibit that behavior, and therefore that group should be essentialized as effectively a mystical construct. And that's basically what essentialization is. When you essentialize groups of people and look at groups of people in a not so nuanced way, you get a mystic interpretation of the way things are rather than an accurate one. And the problem with nuanced, accurate interpretations of things is that they don't sell very well at the box office, which is to say they don't make for good political propaganda, and they don't make for rallying the crowds and the emotions of people to get behind you. So on the point, for example, of men who in the large majority are responsible for many of these shootings, it's often pointed out that that is an essential property of men, violence. Now, women commit violence too, generally different types of violence, but that is an essential quality, that is a mystical quality of men in general, that they be violent and they commit violence. The idea that there's something inherent to any group that is uniform, mystical, and therefore irreparable and unremovable is, again, something that we've seen out of the history books. And I find it fascinating and a bit ghoulish in today's day and age that mainstream screeds like The Guardian, The Independent, what have you, will openly talk about men just being, well, bad because they're men, which is very different, subtle, but different from saying there's a problem and a crisis with masculinity that needs to be addressed, but saying, well, the baseline, the fundamental nature, the essential nature of man is flawed. And let's be honest, most of the time when they're talking about men, they are talking about white men, because those are the only types of men for whom it is permissible to be attacked in the open, and it's given a green light to do so. If you're a man of color, it's probably not the same issue quite. You're much less likely to be attacked because, let's face it, in today's oppression Olympics, the more minority status you have, the higher your status effectively, and your ability to shield yourself from criticism is greater. So, this is related, of course, to evolution. Men, although men have reproductive drives and overarching patterns that can be observed and understood, they don't form a coherent and distinct group, although they are a discrete group from women, obviously. But it's much, much easier, as has been historically the case, to take a group of X, in this case a group of men, in this case white men, and demonize them and say, these are the guys who are causing all the problems. Now, I don't think it'll ever go that far, as I've pointed out, that men themselves become the target of some horrific campaign of violence and extirpation. That's never been the case. But certain groups of men could be, in theory at least. And inasmuch as all of this that they're projecting, these newspapers, mainstream sources, tends to be rank nonsense, it doesn't really matter if it's rank nonsense if they have the power and the influence. So this is a very interesting turn of events I've seen. And there are two interpretations here. One interpretation is that by essentializing men, things have taken a turn for the worse. I mean, men are just quote-unquote bad rather than something that needs to be worked on and improved. Or it could be signs that the people in charge, the powers that be, or the people publishing these types of articles, are losing ground, because one could argue against them that all they have is mud to smear and throw at people. I don't know. But one thing has not changed very much, and that is the lack of attention paid to male-specific issues. Men across the board from all backgrounds are falling behind society. That's pretty obvious. And this subtle shift towards essentialization carries with it, I think, the premise that essentializing men being a mystical thing, that whatever damage has been done is irreparable and incorrigible. And therefore, the consequence of that would be you don't make an effort to improve things, you don't make an effort to try to correct some of these problems that you can observe. Part of this is the Pareto principle, right? If the men at the top are functioning quite well and getting all the goodies and the women, people aren't generally going to pay attention to the men at the bottom or even in the middle. And so this has been talked about quite extensively, but a serious issue that needs to be addressed. Because if only 20% of the men are doing okay, whatever that means, and 80% of them are not, long term that's unsustainable. And even if you don't care about the men in question, there's a pragmatic question you can ask that maybe this nonetheless needs to be addressed. So there are multi-pronged layers to this issue. One, the men at the top, who are usually demonized in a conventional sense, are the successful ones. People, as is convention, tend not to notice the invisible ones. And the ones who aren't so successful are simply, by their nature, through their essentialization, failed products of nature. I think it's always very risky when you take a group of people and you essentialize them to some core group of qualities or principles and then just leave it at that. Now, to be fair, there are many people in the manosphere that do this about women. Rather than making broad observations that you could claim are trends, they say women are this way, it's some essential mystical quality that they have. But ultimately, none of this is mystical and none of this is essential. There are always outliers. But more to the point, even if you have an overrepresentation of certain types of behavior in any given group, that doesn't mean that that type of behavior is a property, an essential property of that group. So whilst you get these cases of shootings in the United States, in which most of the cases involve men, specifically white men, it hardly means that most white men are involved in these shootings. And let's be honest, you can play this game, as people have historically and still to this day, with any group of people, religious, ethnic, or otherwise, and say, well, you see these people represented here, therefore it's an essential quality of this group of people. And in this sense, I'm very much on board with Jordan Peterson's message that collectivizing people, and therefore, as a consequence, essentializing people, is a very dangerous prospect indeed. There's no hard rule which says that nothing of the sort that occurred in the 20th century could not occur again. And with the right media slant and the right propaganda, and people buying into mystical claims about essential properties of any given group, specifically here men, there could be problems. At the very least, the one thing that you'll get, and I think we see on display right now, is a continual denial of resources to men. And whilst men and women do not compete against each other in a traditional sense, there is a type of intersexual competition in terms of resources. Because let's be honest, if there are certain diseases that are more prevalent in women, and they receive the lion's share of public goods and funding and charity, then it only makes sense that disproportionately diseases that afflict men, but are of equal importance, or at least of equal gravity in terms of their lethality, will receive disproportionate funding and less charity, etc., etc. Even if this is the worst it gets, it's still a pretty foreboding message long term, because it tells us through the essentialization of male qualities that there will be a continual denial of resources and support to men across the board. And even men in the highest echelons, the 20%, they get screwed over too. I will say on a final note that I'm not sure how serious these people are when it comes to essentializing men as a group of people with mystical inherent properties. It might just be that it makes for nice headlines and it makes for nice articles. People will read them and they will nod their heads. I don't really know. But that type of language is historically documented and has been, and it really generally has not led to good things for really any of the parties involved. So it's something I think that people going forward should be cognizant of, that essentialization should be avoided, that is, mystifying something, turning into something beyond comprehension, beyond data, information, and explanation as we observe trends and try to understand patterns, is not the best route to go down if you have decent intentions and want to strive for an optimal outcome. Anyway, I thought I'd comment on this because this has been a very subtle thing that over time has crept up and has increased and has definitely been on the rise. More content in the future, assuming I'm alive. Until then, you take care and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.